Hello 4Ks, today I'm gonna show the theory in the Panov-Botvinnik Attack of the Caro-Kann Defense. So of course the Caro-Kann Defense is the defense to the move 1e4, and so after 1e4 controlling the crucial d5 and f5 squares, now black plays this c6 move, trying to play d5 on the next turn. So after the most logical continuation to the Caro-Kann Defense, the move d4 is very good, of course controlling a lot of squares in the center of the board, and now there is this crucial idea of the Caro-Kann defense is to play the move pawn to d5. And now in this position, white has many options, either to push the pawn to e5, to defend the pawn with the knight, or to defend the pawn with the move pawn to f3. But of course, the very solid and very good option is to take the pawn as well. And after c takes d4, now there are two options, either to play bishop to d3, knight to f3 or c3 main lines of the exchange variation, but there is this very aggressive Panov-Botvinnik attack as well, with the move pawn to c4, striking at the d5 pawn right away. And now here is where the theory branches out. Of course, there are many options in this position, either you play knight to f6 or you play the move knight to c6, but of course both moves retransposes to the same variation, but I recommend you to play the move knight to f6 in this position, simply defending the d5 pawn with your knight as well. After knight to c6, if you play knight to c6, then there is this move c takes d5 and you retranspose to the barman defense of the Alyapin Sicilian. And if you don't know how to play the Alyapin Sicilian with the black pieces, then this is not the best, because after knight to f3 you need to know this bishop to g4 line, and then there are some complications where you have two pieces for the rook. But of course, if you play the move knight to f6 on the fourth move of the game, you will be fine. So after knight to f6, of course, after the move knight to c3, but white can start with the move knight to f3 as well. But of course, knight to c3 in this position is the best, simply pressuring the d5 pawn. And now black simply develops with the move knight to c6, and now knight to f3 is the best move. But of course, if white were to take the d5 pawn, and if all pieces trade off, then there is no knight to come to c3 to attack black's queen. Therefore black has more pieces developed and black is slightly better in this position. So the move after knight to c6, the best move in the position is to play knight to f3, simply over defending the d4 pawn and simply developing and trying to castle as well. So after knight to f3, there are three options in this position. Either you play the main line of with the move bishop to g4, or there are two sidelines. You might as well know this move e6, simply defending the d5 pawn. Although you close down this light squared bishop, then there are some ideas when you will fianchetto this bishop to b7, and of course e6 is good as well. And then there is this very awkward move bishop to e6, defending the d5 pawn with your bishop, and this is a big sideline, so we will take a look at this. Firstly, so after bishop to e6, now the theory is to play pawn to c5 here, just closing down the queen side. And of course, with this move bishop to e6, what black is trying to say that he will play g6 and bishop to g7, because this bishop cannot get out via e6 and bishop to e7, because the bishop is on e6. Therefore g6 move is the best, and after bishop to b5, simply putting some pressure on the pinned c6 knight. Of course, bishop g7 is the best, and after knight to e5, now here is where, of course, the attack is on the c6 knight, and now black simply plays the move bishop to d7, simply retreating the bishop back to d7. Therefore, this variation is not particularly good, because you played bishop e6, and now you have to play the move bishop to d7 back. And after bishop takes bishop c6, bc6, and after both sides castles and rook to e1 is the end of the theory. And I think this position is much better for white, although the engine likes black ideas and black position as well. But of course, this knight on e5 is very good. Maybe f4 will be played as well, and after something like queen f3, bishop e3, and before b5, I think white's position is amazing. White has more space in the center of the board as well, and I think black shouldn't play the move bishop to e6 on the sixth move of the game, but should play after knight to f3 e6 or the main line of bishop to g4. So after e6, the theory goes c takes d5, and after knight takes d5, bishop to d3 is the best move for white. And of course, with this move, bishop to d3, white is saying he will simply castle, and then we'll have some pressure on the h7 pawn when black castles his king as well. So after bishop e7, just developing and trying to control the g5 square, black will simply castle short, and maybe we'll play h6, not allowing any tricks with bishop to h7, and all this pressure to h7 will be released when h6 will be played. So after both sides castles, rook to e1 is the best move, and this position can be reached via semi-tarrasch defense as well. And of course, this position is very common in chess. These IQP structures are very okay for white, of course. And after c takes d5, after e6, c takes d5, and now this d4 pawn is simply IQP. That means that this d4 pawn is queen's pawn, that it's isolated queen's pawn mean IQP, of course. And after rook e1, bishop f6, this was the position I was talking about. And this d4 pawn is kind of weak because, of course, as I mentioned, it is isolated queen's pawn. And of course, when black can blockade this d5 square, black is simply fine, and this position is roughly equal, although white has an opening edge. So after bishop f6, attacking the d4 pawn, although it is not really attacked, because after knight d4, bishop d4, there is bishop h6 check, winning the piece back on d4. Therefore, you can play bishop to e4 in this position, and of course after bishop e4, the pawn is simply defended by the queen. And after knight c to e7, simply defending the d5 square once again, and this d5 square is really important. Now after knight c to e7, white simply plays the move queen to d3, of course attacking the h7 pawn. And after g6, not h6, because after g6, this battery is really blockaded, and black will maybe even play bishop to g7, just kinda defending the h6 and the f6 squares. So after bishop h6, as I mentioned, bishop g7, and after bishop g7, king g7, this is the end of the theory. And you can see in this position, I think white is slightly better. Why? Because this bishop is really blocked in, and we'll have to use some tempi to develop to b7, and then we'll pressure the d5 square as well. But of course, this d4 pawn is kinda a bit of a weakness for white, but although when you can trade off these d5 horses, you will be probably okay. And maybe even here knight d5, and bishop e5. Of course, this position is not as good, but it is at least a drawing position. Maybe b3 and queen to c4 is an idea in this position. But of course, after knight to f3, the main line is not to play e6, but to play the move bishop to g4. And here is where the bread and butter of the Caro-Kann Panov attack is. So after bishop g4, now we enter the very, very annoying endgame in this position via the move forward c takes d5, knight takes d5, and now this very awkward move, queen to b3. Why is it awkward? Of course, for me it's awkward. I play this position with the black pieces normally, and of course after bishop f3 and gf3, you double these pawns. This pawn is isolated, and this pawn on h2 is isolated as well. And of course, with this move bishop f3, black is simply defending the d5 knight. And after g takes f3, now black plays the move e6, of course. And after queen takes b7, here is where the theory branches out. The player who knows more theory in this position would get better out of the opening. And of course, with the move queen to b7, now this pawn is hanging on d4, so knight to d4 is the best move. And this here is where the theory actually just starts. And after bishop to b5, knight b5, queen b5, excuse me, not queen b5, but queen to c6 is the correct move in this position. And this is very, very tricky, because after queen to c6, now black is forced to play the move d7. Why? Because if queen to d7, then the rook on a8 is simply hanging. Therefore, king to e7 has to be played. And now there is only one good move. Of course, taking the knight is correct. And after queen to d7, this is the theory. And after knight takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes d5, e takes d5, this is kind of the starting point of the Panov-Botvinnik endgame. And of course, after bishop to e3, king e6 is the theory. And after white castles long, bishop b4, king to b1 is the end of the theory. And this position is very, very annoying to face with the black pieces. But of course, black has this very weak pawn on d5, but white has these three weakness on h2 and on f3 and on the f2 square. Why? Because these double pawns are isolated, and this h2 pawn is isolated as well. And of course, black will put a rook on c8 and a rook on d8, and maybe, of course, with this move bishop b4, black is preventing rook to e1, which is common idea because the king is on e file. Therefore, rook to e1 would be very good, and maybe bishop d2 and trading off into a rook endgame is simply probably holding for both players. But there is one more tricky move after king to e7. Then there is this very, very genius move. Then here there is queen to c5 idea. And what does it do? Of course, after queen to c5 idea, white is sacrificing a knight. How, you might ask? Of course, after queen to c5 check, there is simply knight to d6, and after knight takes d5, e takes d5, now white simply castles. And in this position, I think black is at least slightly better, but of course it has a lot of attacking potential for white. And of course, black has an extra horsey here on d6, but will get a lot of attack. And in this position, the main line goes queen to b6, and after queen takes d5, this is actually the end of the theory. And if you are not prepared very good in this position, you might lose this position very, very quickly if you are black. Why? Because rook to e1 is on the way, bishop g5 maybe, and rook c1, and there will be all this attack on this poor king on e7. So this was the theory in the Panov-Botvinnik attack, and if you are white, you definitely should play this move, pawn to c4 here. Why? Because it is very forcing, of course, attacking the d5 pawn right away, and you will get very good and pleasant positions from this c4 Panov-Botvinnik attack. And if you're black, you shouldn't really be scared of this. Just study this queen to c5 piece sacrifice and you will be fine. So this was the theory, and if you liked the video, make sure to subscribe to follow more such content, and see you guys in another video.